Charles McClafferty, and this is a topic that has interested me for 30 years at least, and it's one of the reasons why I got my doctorate, so I'm going to be listening carefully. For those of you who don't know Todd, he is Associate Professor of Psychology at George Mason University. He has studied many different topics and is particularly interested in what Frankl would call the noetic dimension. If you've seen his book Curious, it's now in paperback. One interesting phenomenon that happened with that book is that it's sold okay in the United States, but when it was translated into Japanese, it sold 22,000 copies right away. What's it up to now, Todd? A lot. And so for a small island, it's selling like hotcakes. So it's available in paperback now if you want it. Shameless plug for the book. But Todd is a twin. He has many twins in his family. He has two daughters that are twins. And one thing you may not know about him is he has to wear black because he has an unusual glow this week. Okay. Last week, he and his wife had a third child, Violet, 8 pounds 3 ounces. So he wanted me to make him laugh before he came on board. I can only make him smile. So, without further ado, Todd Kashdan.
Good? Okay, great. So I'm going to do something different than the other keynotes, which is I'm actually going to try and create time for a Q&A afterwards, so we can actually have an interactive discussion. It is impossible to go into the topic of spirituality without offending someone here. I make no caveats, no concerns about it whatsoever. That's what the Q&A is for, to deal with that. This is a very difficult topic to study. I would suggest for younger researchers, this is not what you want to start your career with. Sex, spirituality, death, these are not topics to start with. But this is what made me interested in studying spirituality. I am a very clear atheist. And it's actually, there's a written trace you can see on listservs about my evolution, about my thoughts about spirituality over the years. And you can see it on positive psychology listservs and existential psychology listservs, where I immediately to argue with people that this is an unnecessary term. That it's basically, essentially, you can break it down into its components, where you've got love, and you have self-transcendence, and you have commitment to values, you have mindfulness, and so why do we need this term spirituality? It seems like excess baggage. And after extensive arguments with my friend Russ Harris, who has his book outside, The Happiness Trap in Australia, he convinced me otherwise, that I was wrong. That actually the addition of all these components, there's something special about this broader construct of spirituality that is not well explained by just breaking into its constituent elements. And I think it's a lesson about the importance of violent disagreement with compassion for the person you're arguing with, if you're on a panel. When it comes to these things, in terms of, and being willing to let your ideas evolve. So how that argument ended was, Russ, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And then 2 days later, Russ, thank you for changing my view about spirituality. So it started off to be an argument, ends with an evolution in my thinking. And that led to this study, which is basically, what do we really know about spirituality? You know, we've got thousands of years of philosophy, religious traditions. We've got hundreds of correlational studies, which we'll get to in a moment. And then the question is, on a science basis, what do you really know about spirituality? This is the 10th conference I'm making live? International Network of Personal Meaning? 7? Okay, we'll get to 10. And still, we haven't gotten that far in terms of actually studying this thing and understanding spirituality. Now, your response will be, there's plenty of personal stories. Books are filled with chapters of spirituality. And what I would say is, as a scientist, okay, that's part of it, but what are the data? Because here's an area where our personal beliefs are hard to challenge. And so really, in those areas where there's really crystallized belief systems, that's where science is most necessary to see between can we handle a little bit of dissonance between what we believe, what appears to be where the data are pointing us to. And people get really uncomfortable with this topic. That I can show something in these data in a future PowerPoint slide that does not fit with your personal belief system, and you'll say, the sample's too small, the methods are wrong. But if it fits with your belief system, the sample's perfect, methods are fantastic. I mean, this is tough territory. So let's hope there's time for Q&A. Shred me new body parts. I will try not to use profanity. It's probably impossible, but we'll see what happens over the course of the next 45 minutes. If you want to have an idea of spirituality for me, this is Baby Violet. This is one of my two twins. I have all girls. My house is all vagina. And myself. And seeing a living thing, and this is great because my wife is really anti-drug, and I'm kind of sort of somewhere further along the continuum for her. And so we had, being at that point when you're in the middle of a pregnancy and you're in the delivery room and you're as a male that you really shouldn't look because this is going to potentially infect your sex life for the next 3 months. But this is the white bear phenomenon. So you're in the delivery room. You want to see, because when will you see a living creature emerge from a vagina? This is a very this fascinating phenomenon. So you're not looking, you're looking, you're not looking, you're looking. And this, to me, is emblematic of a spiritual moment sort of for someone's life or happiness. It's got a blended set of emotions. If you ask me about anything about anxiety on a Palm Pilot at that time, I would say yes to everything. If you ask me about meaning, anything, I would check yes to. If you ask me, do you have any idea what the hell you're doing, I would say yes to all of those questions as well. You would not be able to study this well because it would just be a lot of extreme responses to this event. And now you can reflect back on it, and it's a very different one. In terms of how your immune system changes, how there's another creature on this planet that I would throw myself in front of the bus for, I would take gunfire for. I mean, this is, you can say it reductionistically, it's just another form of meaning, but I don't think that quite captures some of the phenomena about spirituality. You were to figure this out. This is a very weird device. Let me say this. George Bonanno's single point that he was making with his 1-hour presentation was, averages don't tell us anything, if you really want to understand people. And another way of thinking about that is equifinality. That's the jargony term, where there are different routes to the same outcome for getting there. There are clusters of people. Well, let me skip to the punchline of my presentation, which is in a similar vein. Researchers and practitioners absolutely need to understand the difference between studying how people differ from other people and studying how one person changes from his or herself over the course of different contexts. Between person variability versus within person variability. Sounds jargony, but I'm going to walk your way through it. That's the punchline of this talk. This is going to be a geek fest. There's going to be a lot of weird data. I'm going to walk you through it, and I want you to stick with me. I'm going to be pretty playful and provocative because I have no idea how to be otherwise, so just bring the bone. It's also because it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to set this up this way. Laura gave me a nice alley-oop last night, which is basically, this isn't the everyday. Let's not save this under helium and glass in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. for spiritual experiences. This is not about the first time that you discover contact with a supernatural power. That is not the only province of spirituality. It's in the everyday. If we miss that, forget it. Your belief system might be intact, but don't call yourself a scientist because you're not studying. You are validating your worldview. So defining spirituality. Essentially, I love Corrigan's definition. It's nice and simple. It's a tough thing to define. Striving for the sacred is what we're talking about here. Intentionally trying to search for sacred things that transcend the self and committing to that search. Doesn't mean you're going to find anything, doesn't mean you're going to detect anything. It's a commitment there. And this is distinct from religiosity. So when we talk about religiosity, we're talking about more of the public system here. We're talking about an organizational system, a cultural system. There's rules. There's an organized framework. There's a list of what's not part of this religion. There's a list of what is part of this religion. Now, spirituality is often part of a religious enterprise. Religions often have, people that are religious are often extremely spiritual. Not necessarily. You might just follow the rules, but actually not internalize any of this, right? This kind of matches on with what Rich was talking about, the self-determination there. You can be extremely spiritual, you can be extremely religious, any combination of the two. They're not synonymous. If you look here inside the Vatican, it's got a combination of the two. I mean, you walk in here for the first time in the Vatican and see this beauty, and you recognize just what happens when you make that search to attempt to touch something divine, however it is that you're defining that. But religion can get really complicated and sloppy and messy, because there's not just one religion. So on the bottom is a headline from the Washington Post yesterday. This was on the front page of the Washington Post. So these are the two politicians that are fighting off the President of the United States right now. Both of them, religion is their major problem. Because of the percentage of people that are uncomfortable with each one of their religions, which happens to be two different religions, with very different systems and very different rules and very different practices. This is their problem. A large minority of people have a problem with each one of their religious systems. And if you look on top of that, that's the New York Times last week. It said there's plenty of good things about religion, but there's plenty of problems as well, is that your religion means that you don't ascribe to someone else's religion. Someone has to be right, or you're both wrong, or there's a built-in conflict there. So right now, I just want to make clear, we're playing with spirituality, which is a subjective experience that comes from an attempt to transcend the self. Might come in the context of religion, might not. Spirituality comes in all sorts of different variants. So this is called a fire rainbow. High altitude ice crystals that are inside a cirrus cloud. And the sun rays hit it, and you get this fire rainbow. It's pretty rare. You don't find this too often, because often those ice crystals melt pretty quickly. You either have a sun shower, or it ends up basically evaporating in the air. This looks like something out of Lord of the Rings, but this is actually a real Fedor, I think is how you pronounce it, in Norway. So this is 604 meters in height. This is 25 kilometers long, and then at the precipice of this is called Pulpit's Rock or Preacher's Rock, and there's plenty of evidence of this. There were a lot of sacrifices in religious traditions a few thousand years ago. So about 10,000 years ago, there was a break from the fjord to sort of create this particular toothpick that comes out here. It's about 25 square meters on the top. You can crawl up here. It's not an easy hike when it comes out there. And you see a couple people meditating up there. I mean, if you're up on top of this fjord and you're not having a spiritual experience, that's interesting. More interesting than if you are having a spiritual experience. Everyone can think right now what would be the 4 albums they would choose to have here in terms of transcending themselves and having a spiritual experience in music. This happens to be 4 of mine. I suspect that the lower left-hand corner is something that is not really highly popular in this room. That's why we don't hang out in our free time outside of this conference. Jeff Buckley died several years ago. Every time I hear his voice, it's angelic. To me, he's like a human angel in terms of his voice. I hear him, I hear his name, I have a spiritual experience. I have transcended whatever space-time continuum and usually am in a dissociative state. It's not a good time to get into conversation if Jeff Buckley's playing. It comes in different variants. That's why it's so fun to study. It's messy, it's complicated. This is not rats in a maze. So what do we know about spirituality? And I want to talk about how crude the past 60 years of research has been about this incredibly beautiful, sophisticated, complicated topic. If you define yourself, and I know that just by talking to people at this conference and listening to people, if you define yourself as a religious person, if you don't study spirituality, we have not captured you. We have not captured your life. If you define yourself as a spiritual person, we don't study spirituality. This is the nexus of people's existence. And so you can ignore it and study the big 5 personality traits, pick your favorite psychological strength, pick optimism, pick wisdom, pick creativity, write a book on curiosity, courage, pick your favorite isolated construct. If this is present in someone's life, spirituality, it's often at the core. So whatever you study, it's infecting your variables, you're just not dealing with it. Here's what we know. How do people define themselves? Large sample, over 1,000 people. You see that most people define themselves as both religious and spiritual. Very few people describe themselves as religious and not having the spiritual component. Now remember, this is self-defining here. We'll get to later about what I really want to get to later, which is how can we do this non-obtrusively to see people who are in prison, right, who have religious conversions and come out and sell drugs and kill people and engage in prostitution. And I'm talking about not in terms of selling their bodies, but actually being the person that is selling other people's bodies. And then defining themselves as being highly religious with wonderful tattoos on their body that show that I am clearly a religious person. That conflict, that hypocrisy, that's sort of a really interesting future topic, but we'll save that for later in the talk. 47% of people, sample of over 700, strongly agree with the statement. That's the farthest down the continuum on this. I'm a person who is spiritually committed. That's a strong statement. That's not saying I've had some spiritual experiences. You've got values, and you've got behavioral commitment to values. Values are nice, but that's just describing. That's just descriptive. It's the commitment where it leads to the action. You could say, like, I value exercise, but if you're not actually running or exercising, who cares what your values are? They're saying you're spiritually committed. 69%, 1,500 people endorsed this statement. I crave spiritual experiences, spiritual growth in my daily life. Now that's interesting. Again, thinking about the paucity of work that we do as scientists for understanding spirituality. And thinking about also on the practice end. We don't like to touch it. It's a hot button issue. Right? I see this on the listservs a lot. Should we create a Christian positive psychology? Should we create a Buddhist positive psychology? You know, I tend to be of the belief that it's insane to start doing this, to go down the continuum. I would say, figure out what people care about. Don't create little fiefdoms based on every single belief system that exists. But we can talk about that again. 40% of people, significant life alterations as a function of their spiritual experiences. These are not small numbers. We're not talking about what percentage of you have had a sexual experience in your life. We're talking about your life was altered as a function of an experience. These are all surveys. One time. So what I'm interested in is a very simple question. How is spirituality related to well-being? Why is that the case? What's really the driving facet of it? And then when is that more the case? When is that less the case? So here's what we know so far. And I say this because, again, we think we know more than we know about spirituality. And that's sad because it's 2012 and we're a pretty established science as a field. And from that science comes all of you practitioners. So we've got this study. Great paper by, what is his name? David Myers. It's in the American Psychologist about faith, funds, and friends. An external indicator, potentially, of spirituality. The more that you attend church, the more that you report being happy. Cause, correlate, consequence, we don't know. Also, just because you attend church doesn't mean you actually have some spiritual experiences. This might be your source of social, this might be your social network. Right? It's a nice starting point, but it's an external indicator. But it's a pretty nice finding. You've got this really nice gradient across here. It's like the more time that you actually get involved, the more you appear to benefit. But we don't know the chicken or the egg when it comes to this kind of work. This is a meta-analysis of a bunch of cross-sectional surveys. So you'll almost invariably, if you have nice, reliable measures, you're going to get a correlation of 0.3 between two good things. 48 studies, 59 tests, this is basically what you find. Little hovering over a correlation of 0.3, but basically if you have people that are suffering from cancer, from HIV, blood marrow transplants, you're finding basically, and they're talking about what's their quality of life despite having this disease, you find a correlation of about 0.45, and what they're saying is the degree to which they're a spiritual person. And the less specific your measure of well-being is, the smaller that correlation gets. But again, this is what I want to be clear about. Something gets lost between us being human beings that are interacting with people, thinking about people, creating social interactions, forming relationships, thinking about what do we care about in our lives, and then we go into our laboratory, and we print up a bunch of questionnaires, Likert scales, and we hand them a huge packet, and we correlate a bunch of items with a bunch of items. Something gets lost there in the mix. It couldn't possibly be what you were thinking about in the shower at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, oh my God, I think I figured out the way to study whether spirituality really matters. A new questionnaire just came out. I'm just going to throw that into the packet. This is basically what our science has been about spirituality. So conceptually, I want to talk about this just a tiny bit. Many ways that we think about spirituality and well-being is that they're basically synonymous. This is very problematic. This is a big thing in the happiness literature, and it's a big thing in the meaning of life literature, which is there a separation between the thing that you're interested in, that you think drives a good life, and what is a good life? Now, this is not an abstract issue. These are not the abstract topics that are talked about in the panel. If you think being a spiritual person, having spiritual experiences, makes you a kinder person, then you cannot define spirituality as being a kind, compassionate person. Because then, of course, it's going to be linked with being a kind and compassionate person. There has to be some separation between the two. This is not an abstract issue. If you say that you're going to target optimism in somebody with an optimism intervention, talking about optimism, measuring optimism, thinking about optimism, well, of course you're going to have people start rating higher scores on measures of optimism. You've been basically filling their head, optimism, optimism, optimism. There needs to be some separation if we're studying these things. There's my least favorite measure of happiness on the planet, the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire. And you know some of you use this measure. And we published a paper a couple years ago, and we actually showed, well, what's in this measure? It's called the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire. It must be a measure of happiness. Well, we saw that that measure had purpose in life items in there, measures of items that relate to, I think I'm a funny person, I laugh a lot, humor. You've got measures of items that relate to kindness. I tend to be a kind person. I tend to be very generous. And then all these studies are measuring this and correlating with measures of meaning in life, kindness, generosity, and then concluding, happiness leads you to be kind and humorous and have meaning in life. But if you look at the items, yeah, that's what's the measure of happiness has. You have to be very clear and precise. I'm a big fan of Nietzsche. Language precedes consciousness. You have to be very precise. Rick Snyder, when I entered this field, before he passed away, when I talked about what's the number one thing, if you were training people about positive psychology, training people to have better lives, what would be the first thing you do? And Rick Snyder, and he was one of the most humblest people in the field of psychology. And what his answer was that you teach people the language of the positive. And I think that we get really caught up in, let's skip around and keep these really abstract, 5-line terms to define things. That's not going to work, because you're going to work with real people. You're going to talk to journalists that are interested in a soundbite to affect real people. You better be able to define things quickly and in a concrete way to people. So the question is, does spirituality lead to well-being? Does well-being lead to spirituality? Is this bi-directional? And then what parts of well-being does spirituality really start to make an influence? this is what I'm interested in. This is my mantra that affects my work. I think of myself, I hate this term, but someone else coined this, as a contextual scientist, which is study people in the context of their actual naturalistic environments. I love lab studies. I love the stuff that Laura's doing in terms of that weird stuff of manipulating space in the constellations. It's just so hubris-like that I love it. It's great. It's fantastic exposing people to that. That's a context. You're creating context. And also, there's our everyday. What do people actually do? Paul Rosen wrote this great paper called Lessons from Solomon Asch. I make all of my students read this in every class, the first class they take with me. And what this paper is about is basically we skip describing people to start asking really complicated questions. We skip the question of basically just asking, what is it, when you think about meaning in life, what comes to mind? Just describing it. What is this thing? We jump right to it because we're so smart. We went to grad school, but we can just jump right into meaning in life for studying these things. And what he talks about is, if you want to understand people, you have to be able to describe things first and then start trying to predict and influence things. People want to rush to intervention really quickly. A new measure of strength comes out, let's make a strength intervention, let's throw it out in the field, and we have no idea what we're targeting, what's the mechanisms, what we're going into. We don't think through. We just slowly walk through these concepts because they're complicated. People are messy and complicated. How much do we really know about our beloved constructs? I'm throwing a bunch of them here. This is something, a paper that's under review at Journal of Normal Psychology. Basically looking at things, basically predicting how much you actually know about what is a disorder. So we studied these things in everyday life, 14 days, every single social interaction face-to-face that lasts at least 10 minutes. Social anxiety, negative emotions, positive emotions, the need to belong, the satisfaction of the need to belong, feeling as if you're valued as a social being. Baumeister stuff, the degree to which you feel mentally exhausted after socializing with someone. All these are very common things that we study, very common things that we deal with clients. And the question is, to what degree do these change is all of the action between people? There's one person that's social anxious, one person that's socially anxious. One person that's really zestful to use the values and action language, or high in positive emotions, and someone that tends to be kind of just really, they're not that excitable. Almost everything that we do is between people. We compare people. People that are hardy, people that are less hardy, people that are optimistic, people that are less optimistic. But there's a major assumption we're making, is that the action is comparing one person to another person. What I'm going to argue is we're missing a really important thing. How does one person vary from him or herself over time? That we change in predictable ways from occasion to occasion. We are psychologically flexible creatures. This is built into our evolution. We are able to adapt to different situations with different demands. And this suggests a very different approach, a within-a-person approach and a between-person approach. You do this all the time. Your romantic partner that you live with is coming down the stairs. They told you a couple days ago that you don't really deal with the dishwasher too often. And so, as you hear them slowly come down the stairs, you open the dishwasher and very quickly try to put the stuff away that happens there. Now, if your children walk down the stairs, you probably don't touch the dishwasher. You were adapting to context. If I was here and I would see someone in a garb of being a nun or a rabbi, I would probably try really hard to reduce my profanity. Hopefully, I would have some level of psychological flexibility to be respectful. They're probably not into the profane stuff that happens there. If not, I would be rather rigid when it happens this way. You change your behavior. If we believe that assumption, that we modify our behavior depending on context, if we believe that we hold multiple goals that we are pursuing simultaneously in our lives, we believe these things, these assumptions, then studying people and comparing them to other people is not the only way to go. For every one of these constructs, more than 50% of the variance is within person. That means that nearly half or more of the action in social anxiety, satisfying the need to belong, positive emotions, negative emotions, it's not about comparing really happy people and less happy people. That study by Peter and Sullivan, very happy people versus just really happy people. That's between people. This is saying that there's substantial variability from one person varies and oscillates from their own selves across time. When you do not address this, you put all of that to error, you ignore what it's like to be a human being. It's complex, we change, we vary. I was in the hot tub yesterday. I will not point out the psychologist that was in the hot tub with me talking to someone else. I apologize for speaking and bringing this conversation up. This is the type of person I am. You do not want me in your social world. And I was listening to a psychologist talk to a very attractive woman and saying that personality solidifies at the age of 4. She was shocked. He said that was true. It solidifies at the age of 4. I was aghast, but I actually, amazingly, you might be surprised. If you know me, you're probably very surprised. Did not say anything. I just sat there and said to myself, interesting. That's quite promising for as a field in terms of interventions in psychology as a practitioner that solidifies at the age of 4. I'm not sure personality even starts. We've got temperament. And then proceeded to talk about the big 5 and how it solidifies at age 4. There's some work on brain plasticity, which I'm not going to go into, but let's just say that there's some work out there that the brain actually modifies over time. Here's some work by Will Fleesing, which is showing that what if we studied personality with a different approach? Let's not weigh what we think about with the way we measure things. I have a grant from the Values in Action Institute, so I'm not going to talk smack about it. I mean, he knows what I talk about. We're constantly trying to create new and more dynamic measures. Don't confuse a measure of psychological strengths. Froggy voice. Don't confuse the measure of psychological strengths with psychological strengths in a person. These are two separate things. Let's not reify our measurements here. The big 5, there's something to that. Great work. But what if we change the measurement? What if instead of asking people, are you a sociable person? Do you tend to be grateful? Do you tend to be kind? Are you reliable? Right? Conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion. What if instead, every moment, 8 times a day, I randomly prompt you on your smartphone and ask you, did you act in a way, in this way? Were you acting sociable when you were, right before you were prompted? Were you acting kind and agreeable? Were you acting disciplined? Did you show some self-control? Right? I'm measuring the big 5 by measuring your behavior in a situation over time. Look at this. The amount of variability in a single person from one occasion to the next in their daily life, the amount of variability is greater than how they differ from another person. It's a different way of thinking about personality. If you're looking from moment to moment, from hour to hour, from day to day, you see more variability within the same person over time as comparing someone to somebody else. Now that's very promising. What it speaks to is there's a lot of room to change people because we're modifying their behaviors, not this thing called personality, this stable, unmovable structure that defines who you are. Your behaviors are malleable. Now here's the interesting thing. This final part over here, is there a laser pointer over here? There is, but it doesn't matter because you guys are. The variability in how you change in your behavior in terms of the basic personality is the same as how unstable your emotions are in daily life. Interesting. But it gets even more sophisticated than that. Is that our behavior is often predictably contingent on specific aspects of the environment. I said this is going to be weak. So you got to follow me here. My apologies. I can see some people are bored and they're like, I wanted to know what I could do in my clinical practice with the client that's coming in on Tuesday. I don't care. We're going to geek out for the next 40 minutes. So in terms of extroversion, what's the likelihood that you're going to be extroverted in the next hour? It depends on how friendly you believe other people are in the social interaction that you're in with people. If you don't think they're friendly, you're going to be less extroverted. If you think they're going to be friendly, you're going to be extroverted. If friendly, then you're going to be extroverted. Regardless of what tasks you're doing and other things, those are irrelevant. It is contingent on the perception of how you think other people act. Now we've got a more sophisticated view of personality. Agreeableness, contrary to what you might expect, how friendly you perceive other people to be, has almost no relevance in terms of how agreeable you're going to be. If you tend to be an agreeable person, it tends to be irrespective of how friendly you think other people are. That's interesting. Sometimes null effects are interesting. And for conscientiousness, that's no bearing about the social behavior of other people. Do you think this task is intrinsically enjoying? Do you think it's valuable? The task orientation. These are strong correlations, by the way. Look at this. The correlation of friendliness and extroversion in a given moment is 0.6. That's huge. Task orientation and conscientiousness, around 0.6. Huge correlations. That's the correlation between how depressed you believe you are and how anxious you believe you are. That's the magnitude of that relationship. It's not a simple thing as you're an extroverted person. It's the real data, and it's hopeful. Those have to go together. It's not like I'm just searching for hopeful data here. So then I think about how we reify what an intervention is in psychology. Like, what is a therapeutic process? For me, I think as psychologists, and just the social sciences in general, so I'm bringing social workers, nurses, all coming together in a kumbaya here, is that we tend to think of formal interventions. That's a therapeutic process. That is a very narrow view of therapy. To me, it's any intervention or everyday therapeutic process that helps you cope with life stresses, ameliorates mental and physical health problems, helps you adapt to situations, helps you extract rewards out of a situation, helps you just navigate the complexity of everyday social living. This is a therapeutic process. What that means is exercises of therapy, with or without a personal trainer. It means going to Nicaragua with your best friend for 1 week to write a book, and then be at Vulcan Mombacho and ziplining is a therapeutic process. It means when your kids run around naked in a public fountain with their underwear in their head. That's the intervention for me. It's for my entertainment. Child Protective Services, if they come, it's a very different intervention. Going to La Sagrada Familia and seeing La Sagrada Familia, you're talking about an intervention. That's a crazy, powerful spiritual experience for those of you that have seen it. If you haven't, woe is on you in your life. So for me, spiritual experiences in everyday life is an intervention. You don't necessarily need somebody to help guide you. Now, it might help. Probably might help, hopefully. If you evoke the view that you can help people be self-determined in uncovering and, using Laura's term, noticing spiritual moments in their lives. If it's too formalized, you might actually pull people out of their natural meaning-making and spiritual processes. I wouldn't say it's iatrogenic, because I think that's too strong of a word, right? That you doing that is actually going to cause them harm. I would say you're interfering with natural therapeutic processes in the context of everyday life. And as therapists and practitioners, you've got to think about this. Can you put your ego aside, keeping along with the theme that I said in the panel, and actually just let people be, because you're listening to what they care about and do, and just reinforcing what works, and just providing some guidance for what doesn't work. And sometimes you're just not that needed. I know we need a paycheck, I know money's important, but sometimes we're just not needed. So why would spirituality be related to well-being? This is not a point to the labor. It's relatively obvious. One is you have an existential thing. You are connecting yourself to something more profound and transcendent than yourself, right? We had the fire rainbows, we had bizarre little fjords in Norway. Again, Jeff Buckley, Ryan Eno, getting together with David Byrne. If you've never heard that scene, it's awesome. Right? Existential issues. Then you've got the relational issues. If you think about attachment theory, secure attachments, there's nothing more secure than if you believe in something larger and bigger than yourself, whether it's nature, whether it's the universal love you have for your family, whether it's God. This is a stable sense of belonging that you feel. It's not like just getting a hug from someone at a conference, although some of you are good huggers. Some of you men are horrible huggers. And you will see, you will know, because the next time I see you, I will push away the hug and go back to the head, reverse our intimacy. Backwards. Think about the one-arm hug, because you cannot handle it.
Oh, that explains it.
That was long ago. That was like one hug 7 years ago when you were just. So, the spirituality help. Basically, commitment to the ultimate concerns, profound sense of connectedness. We should see an enhanced sense of meaning in life and self-worth. And I'm thinking that self-worth, why would you feel more worthy as a person? Well, the reason is that your worth is not contingent necessarily in what's happening in your social network. Is that you're connecting yourself to something bigger than yourself. I'm thinking more of like a Mark Leary's sociometer model, which is that to some degree self-esteem and self-worth is contingent on how you view yourself as a social creature. If you believe yourself to be committed to a spiritual world, you're talking about being connected to things that can't necessarily reject you. Now, bad things will happen to you. They will. You're going to get rejected, excluded, feel lonely, fail, all sorts of negative things that just could naturally happen. But they won't reject you necessarily for the long haul. Oh, and I want to go back for a second. Just on the bottom here, you can't see it because this is like the font for basically the fine print for a car advertisement. But this is all we have are cross-sectional studies on spirituality. And these are recent studies. George Valiant, who's one of the best researchers and theoreticians on the planet, since 2009, we're still doing cross-sectional surveys on this stuff. This is an experience sampling study of spirituality. Again, just one study, nice and simple. I want to show you the complexity and the beauty and the messiness of studying spiritual life in day-to-day life. What are the benefits of spiritual moments? How and why? If I'm spiritually committed today, how does that affect what my life's going to be like tomorrow? And then when? For whom is this particularly beneficial? Now, right away, you're saying to yourself, I don't have to listen to Todd. It's 87 college students. It's completely useless for this one. Whatever sample I pick, you'll have problems with it. If it's 10,000 people, then a correlation of 0.02 is going to be statistically significant. If I take a bunch of people out of a mosque, well, they're already committed. You've got all sorts of cognitive dissonance issues that happen there. There is no good sample for studying spirituality. So, suck it up. All right, it's 3 weeks. You study these people. By the way, this is with John Neslick. I should give him some acknowledgement because I'll forget at some point. We've got 1,200 data points over these 87 people. So we've actually taken a nice cross-section of like, what's your life actually like? Simple measure of spirituality. Again, criticize the crap out of this in Q&A. I don't care. Build on it. Just do not do another survey study. We were interested in spiritual commitment, matching on to values work. Today, a spiritual part of my life is really important to me. My relationship with a power greater than myself was important to me. We train them really hard about this. When we say, we don't just give them these items. We actually have a 2-hour training session of, when we say a power greater than myself, whatever it is you believe in. And we ask them, like, what comes to mind? We explore all their examples. And what have you excluded when we talked about that? So we make it very clear that where you can go with this. And then we've got daily measures of self-esteem, meaning in life, blah, blah, blah. Boring. Okay. So the interesting question is basically first, no, this is the boring question. So the boring question is to get up is, to what degree do people vary from themselves on these constructs? Now here's something interesting. In terms of their spiritual commitment, most of the variability occurs between people. 18% of the variability is within person. But I'm going to tell you that 18% is actually, watch how much it changes, how much you can explore that 18%. Spirituality, the oscillations between people, is much smaller than the oscillation in self-esteem and meaning in life and emotions. But 18% is still very meaningful. And every time you think about people compared to other people, we ignore that and put it to error. More boring findings. If you tend to define yourself as a spiritual person on a daily basis, you're more likely to have more spiritual commitment, more meaning in life, more self-esteem. Here's something interesting. It's got no relation whatsoever with how much positive emotions you experience in a given day. What happens within a person is not the same as between people. Because it changes also when we look at, on days when you're spiritually committed, you're more likely to have more meaning in life in those days, more self-esteem, more positive emotions, no relationship with negative affect. Levels of analysis, like the world's in hierarchies. You have moments within people. When you look at moments, it doesn't always reflect what you see when you look at personality traits. Right? If you were here before with the panel, everybody's talking about is resilience a process or a trait, but almost everyone on the panel measures resilience as a trait. Well, if you study the process on a daily basis, you find different things. Again, these are the boring findings. Here comes the sexy stuff. So where's the action? In terms of the daily basis, the degree to which you're spiritually committed on a given day, in terms of leading to more self-worth, is it driven by how much meaning in life you feel in that day? And you find, hell yeah, 93% of the variance, that's huge in terms of the mediator, of how spiritually committed you are, how your self-worth is explained by your sense of meaning in life. And it doesn't work the other way around. Because self-esteem only accounts for about 40% of the variance in how much meaning in life you have. There's differential drivers in terms of what is it mostly, what's the biggest mechanism for spiritual commitment? What's it driving on a given day? That's going to freak you out. Mediators, moderators. Maybe it's not the same for everybody. This is what George Kashdan was talking about. Maybe it depends on whether you define yourself as a spiritual person. And here's what we found. Is that if you define yourself as a spiritual person, these are lag effects. And what that basically means is, what we're interested in is the degree to which you're spiritually committed today. How does that affect your sense of meaning in life tomorrow, accounting for how much meaning in life you had today? Right? So we've got this kind of little causal chain, but put causal in quotes. If you're a spiritual person, you only extract more meaning in life the next day. On days when you feel really spiritually committed. There's a 25% difference here. On days when you don't feel spiritually committed, your sense of meaning in life the next day is the same as people that don't describe themselves as being spiritual. Here's the way I define this. Just like exercise or dieting, spiritual people need their spiritual fix. It's that on a given day, if you don't commit on today, you're not going to get meaning in life benefits tomorrow. And so this is a constant, regular, mindful reminder that's necessary. It is not sufficient for you to join a church or a synagogue or a mosque. It's not sufficient for you to join, pay your dues for somewhere. It's not sufficient to have talks that have Christianity in the title. You actually have to commit to behaviors in everyday life where your benefits are no different than people that say spirituality is relatively irrelevant to my life. Context. Again, it's a 25% difference here. That's not a small tamale. And self-esteem, we find the same thing. Is that spiritual people, on days when they're not that committed to being spiritual, their self-esteem the next day looks the same as someone that's not a spiritual person. Context matters. Now, we didn't find anything for the reverse direction. Meaning in life today does not predict how spiritually committed you are going to be tomorrow. Self-esteem today, how high your self-esteem is today, doesn't predict how spiritual. It only goes in one direction. Spirituality is more meaning in life the next day, more self-esteem the next day. Now for emotions, it gets really tricky here. So for those of you that don't know, from the US, we have a black man as president in the United States. He came out with this quote in Pennsylvania where he got crushed by the media, where he basically said when people get bitter, they get pessimistic, they cling to their guns and their religion. And then everybody went in uproar and say, like, what are you saying? Like, we're religious all the time, pessimistic, optimistic, bitter, not bitter. We're never bitter because we're religious. Everybody went nuts on it. Well, here's the data. If you tend to be a really spiritual person, if today sucks for you, defined by really lots of negative emotions, or really infrequent positive emotions, you're more spiritually committed tomorrow. And if today things are really good, you're not that anxious, you're not that angry, you're feeling good, you have a happy day. Tomorrow, precipitous drop in spirituality, spiritual commitment. So there's actually some data to actually back up a little bit about what Obama's saying. I'm not saying it's the be all or end all, but I'm saying I'm looking for replication here for the study. We're doing it right now. But anyway, it's a complicated relationship here. It's on the trait level. You look at spiritual people versus non-spiritual people, all the findings I reported earlier, they all show that if you're religious or if you're spiritual, your happiness is through the roof. But that doesn't capture the process that happens from one day to the next. You've been patient, so I want to show you another spiritual slide. This is, let me see if I can remember this part next year. This is, Cote Angelita Cave in Mexico. Now here's the thing. Here you have this river that you're looking at right here, right? It's easy to forget. This is 100 feet underwater that's happening here. And you're seeing a river, you're seeing a separation. There are trees in this river. There are leaves floating on top of this river. This is when hydrogen sulfide mixes with salt water, it creates a denser mix, and so it actually descends to the surface and gives the illusion there's a river inside of the freaking ocean that's happening there. And so there's actually a separation there. We actually play in this river. This is fascinating stuff. I mean, this is what, to me, when I think of spirituality, I think of the complexities and beauties and mysteries of nature that I will never remotely understand. So I just describe that to you, but still, when I look at this picture, I'm like, you constantly forget that there are 100 feet underwater, deep sea diving to get to this arbitrary river. There is beauty and things that can transcend, like, the world is mysterious. Totally unrelated to my talk. So, take-home points. Spirituality is associated with greater well-being on a day-to-day basis within people. And spiritual people show greater sensitivity to days when they feel committed. There's some primacy of meaning here. Meaning is driving the benefits on self-esteem, driving the benefits on negative emotions, low negative emotions, high positive emotions. Directionality, it doesn't go both ways. It gets benefits in spirituality, but meaning life doesn't drive spirituality. So there's some lingering issues. I don't want to go into too much detail because I want to actually wait this for Q&A. But this is my humility slide to show that there's plenty left to be uncovered here. We got to break into the components of spirituality. I basically have crude measures generally of spirituality. The next stage is, what is it about transcending the self? How do we actually study that in daily life? We're doing that. We're actually doing a study right now comparing spirituality versus religiosity in daily life. I didn't want to do this because I didn't want to create a war between the two. But the thing is, people kill each other over this stuff. People fight over this. It's so weird to me. If you're a spiritual or religious person, this is the most important aspect of your life, and you've been trained your entire life, I will not talk about this with people at the dinner table. That just blows my mind. Like, I will just leave that aside, even though I've been thinking about that all day. So this to me, this is a fascinating topic. So that's why I want to study, even though I don't like rat races. And actually hope that there's actually not too much in terms of spirituality being religiosity or whatever. A purposeful assessment period. We just did a random 3 weeks of people's lives. What I want to be doing next is actually studying, for example, the aftermath of birth. Those 3 weeks, those 3 weeks right afterwards, in terms of changes, like a meaningful period of time when you actually, people that actually join and define themselves as being religious or define themselves as being spiritual, like I said, mine actually started relatively recently in terms of having this argument with someone. Those 3 weeks are very interesting. I started reading books I didn't read before. I started having conversations that I wasn't having before about people because I became more open-minded about this topic. Those would have been, if you were doing a daily diary study, 3 interesting weeks to study from it. I've been told I have to speed up, so I'm going to slight manic mode here, which I have the capacity. Social desirability. The thing about studying people that find themselves as spiritual religious is they're going to give you the answers that match onto their lifestyle and the way they define themselves. And this is what Alan was getting at with identity. The complexity of identity is really hard to get. So how can we do this surreptitiously? How can we actually, it's not just about asking people's friends. Like, how can I actually, I'm interested in actually gang members with tattoos of spiritual symbols in terms of to what degree they actually ascribe to the principles. They're willing to actually, basically mark themselves for lives. I'm interested in how expensive it was, how hard it was to get that tattoo. Here's what a person wants to surreptitiously. I want to capture, follow them around and actually examine their lives. 3 quick lessons from this, and I might wrap this up, and I'm probably cutting into Chris's time, and Chris is a better speaker than I am. False humility. So one lesson is investigating. Investigating everyday events provides new insights about psychological phenomena. We can study the antecedents, the consequences, the directionality of things, and most importantly is, I am not arbitrarily picking the context of what goes on in their lives. 3 weeks, anything can happen. All that messiness, it's all in there. There's a beauty there. What we learned is that trait spirituality is not related to daily negative affect. And then daily spirituality is not related to daily positive affect. Like, new things get uncovered. Variability within people helps to understand how spirituality operates. Spiritual people do not have greater well-being. It is contingent on whether they commit on a given day. Emotions. My apologies for those of you that constantly misinterpret Barbara Partison's work and Alice Eisen's work about positive emotions. It is not the end game. There's a barometer of how things are going. And again, not that I keep on throwing bullets for Laura, but it was the last talk that I listened to. In terms of, it provides insight into what's going on and influences our cognitive processes. What we found is that your emotional experience dictates and influences how committed you're going to be to spirituality the next day. That's interesting. And personality is flexible. If you believe that assumption, you have to reject static approaches. They must be dynamic, and they've got to be contextualized. What's happening there? Thank you. Do I have time for someone to tear me a new Lars? So we have time for a few questions. Awesome.
Non-verbal that will give it to that meaning of life. And would you ever consider actually doing a study with them to see how powerful they really are?
It's a great question, so let me repeat it because some of you might not have heard it before. About studying older adults, particularly in early stage dementia, in terms of their spirituality. Fascinating, awesome. I would love to see somebody that's like, I suspect I would not be doing that. I have so many things that I study, but that's fruitful territory. There's so many things you just hit at one time. Having the older adults, the nonverbals, and early stage dementia. You just got yourself a grand fucking seven.
We have a longitudinal data set. We've collected spirituality and religious variables on 364 alcoholics for 3 years. And we're looking at whether or not spiritual religious change is important in recovery. And the analysis that we've done so far, purpose in life shows up. But so does the strongest predictor was forgiveness of self, which probably correlates highly with your self-esteem measure, although we don't have a measure of self-esteem. But the other variable that was a particularly strong predictor was spiritual and religious practices, prayer, meditation, things like that. Just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, no, I'll add it to the third slide.
Okay.
I have a question about those who are not at all spiritual. Should they be predicted? They're being asked to basically say not applicable every day, and they might be getting irked. And what is having them in there? I mean, how do those inapplicable item responses affect the validity of those measures? And how does having them in there set an anchor that's driving all the other effects?
It's a great question. So, and you know this a little bit. So basically, the question was about having people that really are not spiritual people in the study, and on a study on spirituality. So here's what we found. So these were 87 random people that we studied. We do have a very diverse university, and this may kind of, it's always about the specifics of the sample. We include everybody when it comes to being very comprehensive. We explained exactly what it was about spirituality, striving for the sacred. There were people that scored very low. Nobody scored 0 on any of these, the trait measures of spirituality, and nobody was invariant in spiritual experiences. So you had really low scores in the spirituality measure, and those items that they endorsed, you could say very easily, that's not really spirituality. That's really probably meaning of life that they were actually hitting there. But we saw no invariance in any subjects about committing to something sort of spiritual in their lives, which is kind of interesting in itself. Not in the paper, but I think that was pretty interesting. And we actually played with data. We took them out. The findings are the same whether you take them in or you come out. It's a great question. Please wrap up.